Michael Swain has been married for 2 years to Lynn. Together, Michael and Lynn have 3 grown-up daughters. Michael is the co-founder of His People and Every Nation Church movement in South Africa and Europe, and is an ordained pastor for over 30 years. Michael is the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, known as 4SA, a legal advocacy group dedicated to upholding and promoting our constitutional right to religious freedom. We welcome Pastor Michael Swain.
Well, good afternoon, Michael. It's a privilege to host you. Welcome to sunny Gauteng.
Jonathan, it's an absolute blessing to be here, and thank you so much to this wonderful family for the tremendous support and for this invitation that you've given me. Thank you. Appreciate being here.
Fantastic. So we're going to dive straight in, and I want to, off the bat, just hit you with this question. For those of us in the audience, what is religious freedom, and why exactly is it so important for us?
I think one of the things that maybe people don't appreciate enough is exactly what price religious freedom cost. We don't have religious freedom because one day somebody thought that would be a great idea. In fact, religious freedom was really first recognized in the most formal way in only 1948 by the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It came about literally because of the most horrendous, bloody warfare between, unfortunately, Christian faiths, which pretty much decimated Europe for a period of nearly 200 years. And to give you an idea, in one country alone, after just one of the 30-year wars that took place, there were literally 1/3 of the entire nation had been killed. We have in this country, for example, the Huguenots, and there were at one point 2 million Huguenots. Huguenots actually were French Protestants. They just simply believed what we believe in terms of the Protestant faith. And there was such an orchestrated extermination of the Huguenots at one point that by the time they literally jumped on a ship and came all the way down to South Africa and went and settled in Franche Hoek, which means French corner, there were only about 20,000 left. So when we're talking about religious freedom, we need to understand it is absolutely critical that we realize the cost of it. And also the most important thing is this. To be religiously free, you literally have to be able to believe whatever it is you want to believe, obviously within the law, within the confines of the law, and to express that belief however you want to express it. And the biggest threat to religious freedom comes when the state backs any form of ideology or faith for that matter. When politics, if you like, gets involved in religion, it's an absolutely toxic recipe. And nobody is immune to that. And when we're talking about faith, we're talking actually about any ideology as well. So when you see, for example, the power of the state get behind the communist ideology, then you've got Stalin or Mao. When you see even in the Christian context, in America, we have a day that is celebrated. It's called International Religious Freedom Day. And you may know that one of the founding sort of fathers of America were the Plymouth Brethren. They got on a boat and they literally ran from religious persecution themselves, and they established their colony in Massachusetts. And at some point, they established what they wanted to believe and how they wanted to live, and they set up their institutions. And then a group of people called the Quakers came. And they had a new idea, a little new revelation as to how they felt that you should or could believe as Christians. You would have thought that the Plymouth Brethren would have actually been very receptive and understanding because they themselves had suffered so much. Not at all. Because whenever you have the power of the state getting behind any expression of faith or ideology, it's going to end horribly for someone. And in terms of the Quakers, they literally hanged the Quakers in that colony. So that is why it is so important that we understand that religious freedom is something which, first of all, is inherently yours by virtue of the fact that you are a human being. God endows us with the right to believe what it is we want to believe. God doesn't force us to believe anything. One day we're going to give an account for what we have done with that freedom, if you like. But God does not impose things on us, and we have to be very, very cautious and very concerned when we see the power of a state trying to shut down or silence or push any form of belief or ideology.
Fascinating. My family is descended from the Huguenots. So at the next Sunday lunch, I'm going to say we're one of 20,000, right?
Literally the survivors.
Literally the survivors, yeah. So Michael, 4SA was born. Tell us why 4SA came into being and exactly what is your mandate as 4SA?
We actually came about, and I was interested to listen to Pastor Chris. One of the things he said was that sometimes God will use your enemies to actually accomplish his will and purpose. And there was an atheist couple, and they lived in the neighborhood of a local church, and that church, I can mention its name, Joshua Generation, founded by Apostle Andrew Selly. They were in the neighborhood where their headquarter church was, and the church had run a parenting seminar. And as part of the parenting seminar, they produced a PDF, a manual, and you could go online on their website. And this atheist couple did. They downloaded the manual, and in the manual, they cherry-picked about half a page where there were scriptures. Let's call them the spare the rod, spoil the child scriptures. The folly is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from them, and so on. And they took that, and they sent it to the South African Human Rights Commission. Now, the Human Rights Commission in South Africa is what we call a Chapter 9 institution. There are a number of them. They're set up by the Constitution specifically to give special protection or oversight to certain very key areas of the society and the democracy under which we live. And the Human Rights Commission, which is, as I say, an institution of state, then got hold of Andrew Selly and the church and said, take these scriptures out of your training materials, never teach and preach on them again, and send your pastors for sensitization training. And Andrew Selly phoned me because amazingly and wonderfully, God had joined us together, and we'd known each other for some few years by this stage. And he said to me, what should I do? And I said, Andrew, this is not a question of should you or should you not lovingly discipline your child. This is everything to do with religious freedom. Because if the state can tell you what you can and cannot believe, or what you can and cannot preach, and then tell you to send your pastors for sensitization training, that is about as contrary to religious freedom as you can get. And we have a right in this country, Section 15 of our Constitution, and Section 9, which is also the Equality Clause, gives us the right to believe. It is the right to religion, thought, belief, conscience, opinion. It's much broader, by the way, than just simply being able to pray in private. It is everything to do with you as a human. It attracts to you and attaches to you as a human so that you have the right, not just in private, but in public, to live out, to express your faith. And that is what we need to defend. It's freedom of association. We can meet in a gathering like this. We can associate with people who believe like we believe. It's assembly. It's the right to literally gather together. All these are encapsulated and held in the right to religious freedom. Obviously, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And that is why we need to defend it and vigorously defend it when we see it encroached. And so Andrew, on the back of that, teamed up with a very gifted advocate called Nadine Badenhorst, who I think you may have met, or he's certainly been here before. And together they started to defend this case. And quickly, when they looked up, they realized, actually, this is not just an isolated instance. There is a trend, there is a global trend of pushback against people of faith, particularly, it turns out, I believe, the Christian faith. And this needs to be defended at every turn. And so 4SA exists to protect and promote and uphold our right to religious freedom. And because it's a legal right, we uphold it for all faiths, because every faith is equally affected. And a bad result for the Islamic faith in a lawsuit, for example, or in one instance, and I'll just mention it briefly, a Hindu case where a young girl was wearing a little nose stud after she'd gone through an initiation, coming of age type ceremony. And she was told when she went back to school to take that out because we don't allow jewelry. And she said, but this is an expression of my faith. And the Constitutional Court upheld that. And they said, we actually live in a country where we celebrate diversity. We do not enforce conformity. And we must make space and room for the expression of faith, even in the public school system. And that turned out to be very useful in a later case that we fought. But it also goes to show that it's a right that attaches to all faiths. And of course, if she'd lost that case, then you as a Christian, if you're wearing a crucifix, you could be told, take that off. Or a promise ring, take that off. Or maybe you're wearing a symbol of your faith as a pin, take that off. Well, thank God she won that case. And had we been around at the time, we would have involved ourselves in that case. Because we must understand that we need to remain free to believe whatever it is we want to believe and to express that belief in private and in public in the way we live out our lives. And it is so important that we push back against anything that would encroach against that right.
And Michael, behind the scenes, and we don't even know this often, you're engaged in the trenches a lot of the time. So you've come out the trenches to be with us today. But you've engaged in a number of battles already. Give us some of those battles where 4SA has been involved to date.
Well, one of the big battles that took place really when I first joined the organization, I got kind of swept into it, by the way. I was actually minding my own business, pastoring a church, and I had a marketing business on the side as well. And Andrew Selly, we had regular coffees together, and I asked him at the beginning of, this might be 7 years ago, how are you doing? And he said, I'm desperate. He said, I'm called to the church. He said, I'm called to basically plant and build churches. But this is so consuming, and I can't take my hands off it because I can see how critical it is for all that we're doing. Because if you lose religious freedom, or the measure to which you lose religious freedom, it makes your task of preaching and teaching and discipling so much more difficult. He said, but I just can't let it go. And I said, well, if I could give you 1 day a week, would that help you? He said, oh, that would be amazing. So I arrive at the church. I think it was April the 1st, my first day, about 3 months later, after I'd managed to sort of sort out a few things. And there's Andrew with a caravan and a car and his family, and he's now off to visit his churches for 6 months. So I'm like, what? So I literally pretty much got left holding the baby. I managed to persuade Advocate Nadine Badenhorst not to bail out as well. And we basically then reinforced and strengthened, and have done so over the past 7 years, 4SA, to really watch everything that's happening in the space of what laws are coming out, what regulations are coming out, what policies are coming out, what court cases are being fought or initiated so that we can intervene where we need to. So we are a legal advocacy group, and we fight things on the basis of the law rather than on the basis of, well, I believe X, Y, and Z. So that is where it's so important, because laws dictate what happens in a nation. And if we ever needed a reminder of that, what about lockdown? And that was another case where 4SA really stepped up, because as you may recall, there was a moment where if you went into a casino and you and I were sitting next to one another, we were pulling those handles, that was fine. That was apparently 100%, no problem, no danger of getting infected from COVID. But if you and I had then, maybe our losses had mounted up and we decided it's time to pray and ask God to help us perhaps, if we at that stage had put our hands together to pray, that was a religious gathering, we could have been arrested and put in jail for 6 months. And we basically said that is absolutely unfair discrimination against the faith sector, particularly against, obviously we're defending the church primarily in what we do. And we took the minister of Cogta to court at that point, and on the courtroom steps, literally, they lifted that imbalance, and that remained the case for the rest of lockdown. So that was perhaps a big wake-up call for the church to recognize that our faith rights can actually be literally put on hold if government starts to pass or implement the wrong type of law and legislation. So that was a very big case for us. Maybe another one I could mention was the CRL Rights Commission, which again is an institution of state. And you might remember there was instances that got a huge amount of media attention. Who remembers the Prophet of Doom? Remember the Prophet of Doom? And others, the grass eating, the snake eating. I mean, very bad for the digestion, I would imagine. But of course, the reason why those were profiled and pushed in the media was because the CRL, and I believe obviously the government too, in a sense, were trying to make out that this faith sector of our society is unregulated, and we now need to regulate them. And the process that they tried to put in place in order to do that was to establish peer review mechanisms, so that they would appoint certain Christian leaders or Muslim leaders or Baha'i leaders or whoever it was. And then if your doctrine was acceptable, and ultimately the CRL was the final arbiter of what was acceptable doctrine or not, then you would be given a license, without which, of course, you would not be allowed to preach or teach or to practice your faith or to form a religious organization. And we took one look at this and we said, this is literally the absolute antithesis of religious freedom. And if government passes legislation which puts this type of system in place in this country, that is the end of religious freedom. Because literally, without that license, you wouldn't be able to preach or teach, and what you preached or taught would effectively be dictated to you by government. It took us nearly 5 years to fight that one. Hundreds of meetings, media, and eventually 5 days before Parliament making submissions. Thankfully, the religious community, the faith communities of this country recognized and woke up to the potential danger, and they pushed back strongly enough so that that thing, I'm happy to tell you, is basically dead in the water at this stage. But again, we had to stand in the gap, we had to raise the alarm, we had to identify the issues, and then help people to actually push back against what would otherwise, as I said, pretty much would have been the death of religious freedom. Maybe I could just mention one more. In America, you may be aware, there is very much the separation between church and state. And where that particularly has impacted in America is in the school system, where schools are basically effectively secular places. Religion has been completely kicked out of schools, which actually means simply that another ideology, secularism, has moved in. And we were involved in a case in South Africa where, again, an atheist organization who had the name of, you like acronyms, Oh God was their name. I can't even pronounce it. It was an Afrikaans name, but it broke down to Oh God. They brought a case to basically ban 71 religious observances in public schools. And they claimed that this was freedom of religion, and in fact, no, it wasn't. It was freedom from religion. And we said, this is not the case in South Africa. We are a very religious, faith is very important to South Africans. You just have to look at the national statistics, and you can see that nearly 80% are Christian. And there are very few people who don't subscribe to some other form of faith, even if they don't subscribe to tea. And we also said that the Constitution protects religious freedom, and it protects even in public institutions. And thankfully, the judges agreed with us. There were 3 judges in the High Court, and they said that the body, and this is really, I think, for parents perhaps something of a wake-up call if you have children in school, the body that will decide what the religious policy is in the school, and we're talking public schools here, is the school governing body. And the school governing body is a critical gatekeeper of what goes on or not in schools. And so they've been given, for example, the responsibility to put together a policy to allow or not what they will allow in, how they will basically regulate the religious observances that take place. And so, just so you know, very much schools are open to faith. Schools are open to pastors. Many schools are actually crying out for pastors to come in and help because they have so many issues that are happening in the schools. So those are just some of the areas where 4SA has, I think, really stepped up and prevented something which would have fundamentally shifted the religious freedom balance in this country in what we would have seen as very much the wrong direction.
And I think we're all very grateful for that. We're facing a number of challenges at the moment. What would you say is the current biggest challenge we have that can seriously just impact on the expression of our faith?
Well, the biggest one, and this is one that we're fighting, and if you follow us on social media at all, hopefully you'll have discovered this. There is at the moment, and this has been now initiated in 2017, something which we call the hate speech bill. It also involves hate crimes. Hate crimes we don't have a problem with because all the bill is actually doing is it's actually codifying, which means it's putting into law things that are already in place in law in any event. So it's just putting them into one place. But the hate speech element is extremely dangerous. Hate speech is something that I think every one of us would say, we don't want hate speech. But The question is, how do you define hate speech? Now, the Constitution defines hate speech as an advocacy to hatred with an incitement to do harm. So classic hate speech would be kill the farmer, kill the Boer. Who do we want you to hate? Farmers. What do we want you to do to them? Kill them. You can't have much more plain hate speech than that. But the problem comes with the definition, and we often say the devil is in the detail. And so this particular piece of draft legislation is very far advanced at this stage. It started off in 2017. The Department of Justice introduced it. Some 70,000 people pushed back against it because, among other things, it had no protection for any form of bona fide religious expression or speech, regardless of how well-meaning or well-intentioned you were. And we pushed to have an exemption clause put in that would actually protect that. They put one in. It was very half-hearted. We didn't like it because it didn't offer adequate protection. There's then been another round when it went to the General Assembly, before the first House of Parliament, the National Assembly. And before the National Assembly, over 100,000 people said, we don't want this. The other reason, by the way, we don't want this is because it actually makes hate speech a crime. A crime which carries an 8-year jail sentence if you're found guilty. And the problem with that is, of course, is that in a democracy, you should actually be encouraging more speech, not less. And as soon as you define hate speech broadly and widely, then you actually shut down free speech because people, among other things, tend to self-censor. They tend to realize, oh my goodness, I better not say that. And so what does this hate speech bill consist of in terms of its definition? Well, one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't actually give a definition for the word hate. You would have thought that the hate crimes and hate speech bill would at the very least define what hate is, but it does not. Secondly, it's going in the wrong direction. We've all been saying there should be no jail sentences. This should be a civil matter. And there is law in place, by the way, the Equality Act, Papuda. There is a hate speech clause. You might remember John Quilani, if you followed that case. That was deemed by the Constitutional Court to be hate speech. They defined what hate speech is. But in a civil instance, what you do is you basically may be made to pay a fine, and it can be a very heavy fine, or make an apology, or do community service or something, but you don't go to jail. There is also, by the way, the common law crime of crimen injuria, which, as you may remember, the case of Penny Sparrow and Vicky Momberg, and they made some very nasty racist comments and remarks. They were convicted of crimen injuria because what they said so abrogated and undermined the human dignity of the people who they were speaking to or who were in face of what they said, that was amounted to a criminal offense. But we don't need an actual hate speech crime, least of all one that carries an 8-year jail sentence. Initially, it was a 3-year jail sentence, and we said, no, that's too much. In fact, there should be no jail sentences. It's going in the wrong direction. Now, it's an 8-year first offense jail sentence. The other thing which is problematic about it is the way that it defines harm. You're not allowed to incite harm, but what is harm exactly? Well, according to the definition in this bill, harm includes emotional harm, substantial emotional harm. But think about that for a moment. That is completely subjective. Does that mean that you've really upset me or my feelings are badly hurt? And of course, if you don't know what this actually means, or if it's so nebulous and loose, then just about anything that you say could be harmful. Another question, of course, is who actually is able to bring a charge of hate speech? And there's a whole group of new categories that are being introduced in this bill, one of which, and I'm not saying this for any particular reason, because I do believe that people can live out their lives as they can and as they wish to. So, and I have no problem with their right to do so. But I do have a problem when potentially I could say something which is contradictory simply because of my sincerely held beliefs in my faith, and that might end me in jail, and that is gender identity. Gender identity has now been included. And so you could say something on the basis of your faith that you believe that God created male and female, or you want to talk about what you believe marriage should be, or in God's eyes you believe it should be. This could potentially really upset somebody else, and you could potentially find yourself in jail for up to 8 years. The exemption clause that we also said is inadequate, essentially, when you break it down, it says that you are protected from being found guilty of a crime of hate speech, according to this particular new law that's coming in, as long as you don't actually do something which amounts to hate speech in terms of this law. So it's a sort of circular argument. You know, you're not guilty unless you're guilty. That's not really protection at all. So this is a very, very dangerous piece of legislation. It is now before the National Council of Provinces. So we have a two-tier parliamentary system in South Africa. The National Assembly, which is typically what you'll see on TV, and then the National Council of Provinces. This is the second house. The National Assembly's passed it, and it's got worse as it's gone along. It's now before the National Council of Provinces, and they have given us only until Monday, the 22nd of May, just round the corner. So make a note of that, because we have only got until then to raise our voices to say no to this piece of legislation. If we don't say no, and if we don't say no in big numbers, the biggest danger is this. Every time the bill moves from, which it has done, the Department of Justice to the National Assembly, and there are openings for comments, and we've commented a lot, 100,000 people, as I said the last time, the assumption is that when it moves forward, all those comments have been taken into account and everybody's happy. In fact, it's got worse. If we don't speak up now, and it goes through the National Council of Provinces, let's suppose only 5,000 people could be bothered to speak up at this time, government will argue, and by the way, they're going to fast-track this, so by the end of June, they're hoping it's going to pass the NCOP, and then the president, they believe, could sign it off by August. So what I've just put forward could be the situation in law that we will be living with and under from August this year, because once the law is passed, it is in force and enforceable. We need to speak up, because the assumption will be, well, they must be happy with it. The people have not really said that they're unhappy with it. They were unhappy, but obviously this draft, 2 thumbs up, could not be further from the truth. I grew up in the UK. I studied law at the University of Bristol. And one of the questions I asked my professors were, what is there in this country that actually protects our rights? Because, you know, England's the glowing symbol of democracy. And they said, well, we've always been a Christian nation. The Magna Carta, William Wilberforce, John Wesley, David Livingstone. I mean, all these names that we know have come out of the country that I grew up in. And of course, we're always going to be a Christian nation. Well, first, and a pastor who was a street preacher preaching in the city of Bristol, right where I was studying, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. Now, we would think that that would be something which every Christian could say and probably should say when they're speaking about their faith and telling others that you need to take the claims of Jesus Christ and his authority seriously. He was arrested on the breach of the peace charge, which was basically because of what he said. And the Crown, which is the state, argued in the case, 21st century Britain, you quote certain scriptures in public, that will amount to hate speech. The Bible in the UK is now seen as hate speech. And I'm just pointing across to international examples, because when these laws are passed, this is what follows. It's the inevitable consequence. In Finland, has been tried for hate speech, and now she's being tried again for the same offense. Hate speech, tweeting scriptures in Finland equals hate speech. To understand that while we have the opportunity to push back and say no, we need to push back, and we need to push back in numbers, because it's a numbers game. And that's what this government will ultimately listen to, particularly because 2024 is the opportunity for us to perhaps even make our voice heard at the ballot box if we don't like the laws that have been passed by this government and under which we now may find ourselves living. So I want to encourage everybody, you literally take time to make a submission. It is not difficult. There's a simple website. You can go to our website, forsa.org.za. I think we're going to have the details at some point. And you click a link, and within 2 minutes, you can make your submission. Every voice counts, And the more voices we raise, the louder our voice becomes. And we need to push back while we can.
Absolutely, the fight is real. We were chatting earlier today, just saying, we're worrying about potholes, we're worrying about this and that. The biggest threat we're facing is this thing. So we really want to encourage you. The link was sent out to the network in the last week. So it's all there just to distribute far and wide so that we can be part of the fight.
And literally every member of the church, not just the church itself, not just the leaders, but every single member, because every single member is going to be affected by this. And it's often the person who inadvertently says something that isn't a profiled figure. I mean, I can say something, and if it happens, so what? I mean, that's just what I put my hand up for. But it could be somebody just simply making a statement, and somebody overhears it, or somebody reports them, and the next thing, bang, here comes, literally, in this instance, the police.
Maybe just share with us, Mike, we were on a Zoom call last week with a lot of leaders in the country about this. And I said to you after the meeting, there were more Muslim leaders on that call. Maybe go into that quickly.
Well, it may be because the Islamic faith takes these things more seriously than Christians do. And they're perhaps more awake to it and more alert to the possibility of it. And I believe that obviously this is going to be something which is going to affect all faiths. So in faith, or even for that matter, not, they could equally be caught in the cross.
So that's our current threat, right here, right now. So we're alive and awake to that.
The 22nd of May is not long away.
Yes.
And we have to get our submissions in before then. And the reason, by the way, why we need to make submissions this time round is because in the event that this law does come into force, in other words, goes through the COP, the president signs it, then we, among others, will then obviously bring a lawsuit against it to challenge the fact that it is unconstitutional, which we're absolutely persuaded that it is. But of course, one of the arguments the government will make is, but people are happy with it. If we have got the numbers. We need the numbers, part of the ammunition, if you like, that we bring to bear when we challenge things in the Constitution. And just to give you for instance, as I said, when a law is in force, it's enforceable until such time that it is changed or repealed. So we also have the PAPUDA, or Equality Act, which has the definition of hate speech. Was, as the Constitutional Court decided 21 years later, unlawful and unconstitutional, but we've been living under that definition of hate speech, that unlawful, unconstitutional definition of hate speech, for 21 years. So when it gets passed, it is often a lot easier than cure. And we have the opportunity now, by raising our voices, by speaking out, by sending in 2 minutes of your time, to actually raise this standard against what could otherwise be a very chilling effect upon our religious freedom of expression.
All right, thank you. Looking forward, you always like to look at the horizon. You're busy with current battles.
One of the big battles that I believe we're facing is the battle for the next generation. And there is, let's say, a raft of protocols and guidelines and toolkits. They're not policy, because if they were policy, parents would have to know about them, and we'd have to be given the chance to actually speak into them, and government would potentially have to listen. But they call them by different names. And what this is effectively doing is it's bringing in a very liberal viewpoint on sex and sexuality and teaching it to little children literally from the ages of 0 to 9 years old. So I don't know if we've got on the screen a couple of quotations, because I want to show you so that you understand where this is going. One of the things that we are pushing back against is something called the ECE toolkit. The ECE toolkit is a teacher training program. It's already been implemented. It's been piloted in KwaZulu-Natal. 4,000 teachers were trained. It's already been rolled out in 5 provinces. We just got wind of this, by the way. It's sponsored internationally by a Belgian organization. They gave 40 million rand for this purpose. A little bit like, by the way, the comprehensive sexuality education, which our government has now ceded to the United Nations to redraft for us. When that came in, USAID also gave a donation of 450 million rand so that that could be implemented through the schools. We pushed back hard against that, you might remember, in 2019. But this is now what this whole thing is about. And this is what teachers are taught to teach little children. So they're going to say to your 6-year-old, your 5-year-old, you may have been raised with the idea that there are two sexes, male and female, and that they align with two genders, like men and women. But both sex and gender exist across a continuum of possibilities. And what they are told and to do is to tell children, or to give children the opportunity to help them break free from harmful gender stereotypes that hold them back in life. Now, we're not talking about, women should have the opportunity to serve in the boards of top companies and that sort of thing. We're talking about basically teaching little children that just because your name is Michael and you have certain physical attributes or secondary sexual characteristics, you could in fact be a girl. And for little children, that is deeply confusing. And once you basically confuse a little child to that extent, you've literally distorted and disturbed them at a very fundamental level. Here are some more quotes. Growing up, most of us were taught that if you were identifying a single person by a pronoun, you had to use he or she. These are exact quotes, by the way, from this ECE toolkit I'm reading you. They was only for groups of people. Those rules have changed. Since when has English grammar changed? This is not an English lesson. This is an imposition of an ideology. They or them, it goes on to say, is now a non-binary way to address someone. Using they and them will let children know that we cannot assume somebody's gender identity just by looking at them. Except in 99.9999999% of the time, you literally don't even have to glance at somebody before you know it's a man, or it's a woman, or it's a boy, or it's a girl. And again, here's the interference. Many families and communities, i.e. churches or mosques or synagogues, hold to prevailing harmful gender roles and boundaries, and may also impose those gender stereotypes and expectations on children. What is the state doing through the Department of Basic Education, interfering with what is, even by their own policy definition, the inalienable right of parents to raise their own children according to their own values and beliefs? That is your right in law. That is guaranteed by international law. It's even guaranteed by the Department of Basic Education's own policy that they've adopted. Why are they now trying to impose this through teachers onto children, which will completely cut across your, as a parent, view of what you believe you want your child to grow up knowing about sex and sexuality and gender? But this is coming in, and it's coming in multiple ways, and it's literally being brought in to infuse the whole education system. To give you an idea of where this can go, and I want to just maybe qualify it by this. I absolutely believe that under no circumstances should any child be picked upon, bullied, singled out, no matter what they do, no matter what they look like or how they feel or anything. That is not the issue here. I'm not also saying in any way that you should not, as an adult, be able to live out your life and do whatever it is you want to do to live out your life as you see fit. And that can include changing your gender identity and changing your body shape or parts or whatever it is that you want to do. But here we're talking about the state effectively bringing what is an ideology, and it's effectively, therefore, like a faith, and imposing it into the school system through these protocols, through these guidelines, through these education lessons and learning plans. That is not their job. And what it is doing is it's causing a world of confusion for children. So to give you an idea of where this has gone internationally, historically, approximately 1 to 2% of people identify as LGBT. That's been, now some people say, well, that's because you weren't ever allowed to come out into the open and now you can. But here's a statistical anomaly. One of the things that was also very much frowned upon in the not too distant past, and I think I can remember it myself, is if you were left-handed, you were basically not allowed to write with your left hand. They would literally, in some instances, tie your left hand behind your back to make you write with your right hand. Now that, of course, was wrong. It was abusive, and was then obviously made unlawful, and that practice stopped. And 30% increase of people wrote with their left hand. So you saw a shift, because now you'd, if you like, taken away the restraint. In this instance with the LGBTIQ+, and that obviously includes transgenderism, in some places in America where this is now taught mainstream in the schools, it's gone from less than 1% to 20%, and in some instances 30%. That is literally a tens of thousands of percentile increase. That is a statistical anomaly that cannot be put down to just the fact that now people are now more free to live out what they want to believe. I believe it's come about because this ideology is causing deep confusion to children, and they're simply responding in ways because they don't have the mechanisms in their literally cognitive and psychological development to actually process this correctly. And it's causing serious harm, I believe, to children. And if you as a parent are happy that your school adopts that type of policy, well then sit and say nothing and do nothing. But the school governing body is the gatekeeper. You don't have to allow this into your schools here in South Africa. So if you're not involved in the school governing body, or you're not involved or in touch with your school management team, you need to be. And next year, I think it's in March or April, there are elections for school governing bodies. And I want to encourage people. You might think school governing bodies, what a waste of time. You know, it's going to be who's going to pay for the cleaning of the toilets or something like that. Not at all. Two things I've mentioned just here right now. Number one, school governing bodies can set the religious policy and framework as to what faiths can and cannot come into school, what observances of faith can or cannot take place in a school. And number two, you're the gatekeeper for the curriculum and the content. Not the curriculum, that's set by government, but the content, how it's taught, who teaches it, the way that it's taught. That's your gatekeeper role on the school governing body. So I want to encourage people, and parents particularly, get involved in your school governing bodies because you can potentially keep this out. Because when it comes in, it really is like poison in the water. And once it's in, it's very difficult to get rid of. So that's going to be, I'm afraid to tell you, what we're going to be facing next, and it's going to come pretty much hard on the heels. So probably, June, July, we're going to start really pushing this and asking people to put pressure on government. Because government is saying at the moment, we don't need to have any public participation. Parents don't need to know. We're just training the teachers. It's like, no. The teachers you're training are going to teach what they're trained to teach to my children or my grandchildren. And that, you cannot say, I have no say. And I absolutely have a say. And I think we need to stand up and say, we will not just simply sit back and allow this to come in without, at the very least, seeing exactly what is being taught to our children and who's funding it.
It's chilling stuff, Michael, but what gives us comfort is I think we're all more aware just of the role 4SA is playing in South Africa and the incredible work that you guys are doing. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions and answers, but Michael is around. He's here for the conference, so if you see him out there and you have questions, please go and chat to Michael. But ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for Michael Swain and 4SA. Thank you, Michael.